Unit 6. Individual Differences. Presentation 5. The Cognitive Approach to Psychopathology.
In this presentation, we'll be taking a look at another psychological approach to psychopathology, the cognitive approach. Before we launch into the examination of this approach, let's remind ourselves what we mean by the term psychopathology. Psychopathology refers to those behaviours or experiences that indicate the existence of a mental disorder.
The cognitive approach to psychopathology is based on the view that abnormal behavior is a consequence of distortions in the way we think about the world. Distortions in the way we process information are found in a number of mental disorders, including anxiety disorders, depression, and schizophrenia.
Key features of the cognitive approach. The first key feature of this approach is that abnormality is caused by faulty thinking. The cognitive approach assumes that a person's cognitions direct their behaviour. In other words, how a person behaves is determined by their thoughts, their attitudes, and their expectations, that is, their cognitions. Psychopathology is the result of distortions in these cognitive processes. If a person engages in faulty or irrational thinking about themselves or other people, then this causes them to think or behave in a way that we consider abnormal.
Can you give us an example to make this a little clearer?
An irrational thought that many people have is that they think they are completely responsible for everything that happens to them. As a result, if something bad happens, they believe it is their fault, and this may sink them into depression.
I suppose another example would be the belief that some young people have that if they're not in an intimate relationship, then this means they're completely alone. This would then make them more vulnerable to the development of an anxiety disorder or depression.
The second key feature is that the individual is in control of their thought processes. This is in direct contrast to most other approaches to psychopathology, where factors outside the individual's control, such as genetics or their learning history, are thought to be responsible for their abnormal behaviour. In the cognitive approach, psychopathology occurs when this control goes awry. Shall I give you an example? Some people have adopted a life's shit way of thinking about the world. They believe that everything in life is bad. Nobody is to be trusted, and nothing good will ever happen to them. They may not bother applying for university because their faulty thought processes tell them that they won't get in. They wouldn't be accepted by other students, and so there's no point in even trying. No matter how much they want life to be better, their negative way of thinking makes this impossible.
The third key feature is that this faulty thinking prevents the individual from acting in a way that is healthy and constructive. Albert Ellis explained this in terms of the ABC model.
A is the activating event. For example, we hear someone walking behind us as we walk home at night.
B is the belief. This can be rational or irrational. When it's irrational, it is an example of faulty thinking. An example of a rational belief that might be caused by this activating event is that it is merely a harmless pedestrian that happens to be there at the same time as we are. An irrational belief is that these are the footsteps of a mugger and we are about to be attacked.
C is the consequence of the rational or irrational beliefs. Rational beliefs lead to healthy emotions, such as the comfort of knowing we are not alone. Irrational beliefs, on the other hand, lead to unhealthy emotions, such as terror or paranoia.
Evaluating the cognitive approach to psychopathology. The cognitive approach essentially blames the patient for their abnormality, as it is the patient and the patient alone who is responsible for their thought processes. This overlooks the role of life stressors, such as being in an abusive relationship or losing a job in the onset of mental disorders. By focusing only on the patient's thought processes, Recovery seems possible only by changing the way the person thinks about events, rather than changing the life stresses themselves.
Research from Holmes and Ra has shown that life stressors such as divorce and redundancy make us more vulnerable to depression and anxiety. So, it can't just be the way an individual thinks about life that leads to mental disorders.
That's right. And don't forget all the research on the effect of work stressors. Many of us undoubtedly spend our lives in very stressful environments, so we can't just dismiss their problems as faulty thinking.
A second problem for the cognitive approach is the fact that not all irrational thoughts are actually irrational.
I think maybe you need to give an example to explain what you mean by that.
Let me do that with the fact that people with depression may actually have a much more realistic view of the world than those without depression. Lauren Alloy and Lynn Abrahamson initially called this the sadder but wiser effect, although nowadays it tends to be known as depressive realism. Research has consistently found that depressed people appear to have a more realistic perception of their importance and their abilities than those who are not depressed. People without depression are more likely to have inflated self-images and a tendency to view the world through rose-coloured glasses.
A strength of this approach is that it has led to a number of effective therapies that are based on its predictions. Cognitive therapy helps patients to correct the faulty thought processes that lead to negative moods and behaviours. Studies have shown that cognitive therapy is an effective treatment for depression and is comparable in its effectiveness to antidepressants and other forms of drug therapy. For example, a meta-analysis carried out in 2002 by Bruce Wampold and colleagues concluded that cognitive therapy was possibly even more effective than antidepressants in managing depression. The fact that substituting healthy thoughts for negative thoughts improves a person's mood state is powerful support for the main predictions of the cognitive approach.
A final problem with the cognitive approach is that we are not sure whether faulty thinking is a cause or a consequence of psychopathology. Suppose somebody seeks medical help because they have the symptoms of depression. During this initial meeting, we find that many of their thought processes are irrational and negative.
Like believing that whenever something bad happens in their life, it must be their fault, regardless of whose fault it actually is.
Our patient has all the symptoms of depression and the faulty cognitions that we also associate with this disorder. But which came first? It is possible that faulty thinking has caused the depression, but also that the depression has caused the faulty thinking. This is often what happens in individuals with depression as they develop a negative style of thinking about life.
It's also possible that faulty thinking makes an individual more vulnerable to developing disorders such as depression. For example, somebody with a life is shit attitude is more likely to experience negative experiences because they don't make the effort to make good things happen in their life.
What can we conclude? The cognitive approach clearly has an important role in our understanding of the origins of abnormal behaviour. We should, however, end with a note of caution. The approach, and indeed the treatments derived from this approach, emphasises the contribution of irrational beliefs in the development of psychopathology. However, although a person may hold irrational beliefs, they may not be aware that they are irrational, therefore may not report them or indeed accept that they are irrational. This poses problems for cognitive explanations that have not yet been convincingly resolved.